army also, the average soldier couldn't read. The centurions could read because they needed to, because they were the nerve center between the higher commanders. So again, most people in the Roman Empire could not read and write, only the nobility. So then let's take it again. The Romans at the end had a system of 6 liberal arts, to which the medievals added a 7th. And the principal ones were what's called the trivium: logic, rhetoric, and grammar. Grammar being highly important. Grammar is not taught anymore. Or if it is, it's only in a limited capacity. I remember when I was a kid, obviously not getting it, but I was taught grammar up until about 5th or 6th grade. And then it became a matter of, read this story, what do you feel about it? And then you get to high school, and the teacher's handing you out John Lennon lyrics. And in fact, I had a teacher for creative writing who handed us paper and said, now I want you to write as much profanity as you can, as many curse words as you can. That just express your feeling. And then you got A's depending on what wide variety of cuss words you could use. But I'm sorry, that's not educated or enlightened. As much as modern man thinks he's more enlightened than previous generations. Now, grammar is highly important because it structures your modes of thought and shows you how to express yourself within a given set of rules. The rules that come down from the language. In that way that you express a greater eloquence. That falls into rhetoric, expressing eloquence, and then logic, expressing into thought in a manner that is coherent and it follows in progression toward a point. How do you make an argument? How do you hold up an argument? Now that doesn't mean that you couldn't use logic to bring up all kinds of sophistries and various other things. But that doesn't mean that logic is a useless tool. That's the idea that people have today. From that foundation, of course for the Romans you have 3 more arts, so to speak. And for them you have arithmetic, or any other kind of higher math they might have had at that time, but generally that was arithmetic, or studying the propositions of Euclid. The term just comes from the Greek word arithmai, which means numbers. Then there is the issue of music. Music was important, and astronomy. And medievals later on added on art. So that makes the 7th one, the quadrivium. So these are the 7 liberal arts. Now the Romans had these and they handed them on, which is important. Many things in the Roman Empire did not get handed on to the medievals, which is why the medievals had a very late start in science. It is falsely supposed they had no scientific understanding and they're all just sitting around in mud holes until finally the Renaissance happened, which is a gigantic myth. It's just wool that's been pulled over our eyes by atheists and by the humanists who just love classical culture so much that the only thing they could do is demonize the previous culture rather than also value its traditions. It's one thing to say, oh yeah, well, I love Cicero and I love the Romans and I like them better. But they didn't just do that, they demonized the previous generation and everyone who came before them, without which they would never have had any classical culture, because the medievals they handed it on. But that's also for another lecture, and then the Church and Science, which I'm doing in a few weeks here. So they handed on this tradition and the monasteries kept it on. They even taught local children it. So as the nature of things changed and slavery became a thing of the past, first the transformation of serfdom, which granted rights to the peasant, including to own his own land. The former Roman slave on these large estates, well, guess what? Now he owned the land. It was his forever. Well, until the capitalist revolutions in the 16th century that took it away from him. But that's beside the point. He now had the land. He had rights to it. He had to work, and he had a very difficult life. There's no denying that. Gradually became the peasant, and so on and so forth. And now he received sometimes education from the monastery. The monasteries protected what they received, and they handed it on. So that these 7 liberal arts constituted the basis of education. Right? And then, once you had passed these subjects, and you had mastered these subjects, then it was possible to go on to higher things. Civilian education, which is generally where you went into for bureaucracy. There's also the military education, which you would get if you were in the upper military aristocracy, if you were a knight. A lot of times you'd receive a military education and tactics. This is largely after Charlemagne that such an education existed. And then you had the possibility, you had clerical education, which was in the monastic school. As the Middle Ages rolled around, you had an increase in higher disciplines. You had the legal discipline, which arose in Bologna, the University of Bologna, which covered Roman law and began the study of law itself, and then the various things they'd received in the tradition of law, how it differed from Roman law, and how to make arguments on law. They had then rediscovered medicine. The medievals had medicine. Wasn't terribly advanced because they didn't have access. They had very few things in the way of medicine. But they were going abroad more and more seeking it. And this is highly important. As I mentioned before, medievals weren't sitting in mud holes. They were seeking knowledge because the faith is inherently welcoming to science, contrary to what you're generally led to believe. St. Anselm has this great expression in the Metalogium, fides quaerens intellectum, faith seeking understanding. So that men were going abroad. For instance, Pope Sylvester II, before he was Pope, went to Spain, found Mozarabs, who were there Christians who spoke Arabic, to translate from Arabic various texts of mathematics, because the Arabs themselves received tradition from the Greeks, worked on it, improved it themselves, and took unresolved questions and dealt with them, and they had books on it. And he wanted them, right? This is a future Pope. He made globes, right? Medievals did not believe the earth was flat. It's another myth we've been told. He wanted math, so he sought it, right? Here's a man who knows, he was teaching math in Europe, and he was smart, and he said, I want more knowledge, right? And this is also a sure sign of what education is supposed to produce. Someone who wants knowledge, who loves knowledge. The first school I taught at, there was a priest there who chaired the religion department. I sat and talked to him, and we were talking about different things, and I said, the problem is now we're entering in a real dark age. He said, you're absolutely right. It's debatable whether or not there was a first dark age, but absolutely we're going to a new dark age. And it's because people do not want learning. They want their gadgets. They don't want learning. We'll deal with that later. So this Pope went to Spain to get texts and mathematics and brought it back to Europe, which started the whole revolution of recovery of texts. It used to be assumed that it all came from Byzantine agency. That the Renaissance happened because the fall of Constantinople, all these Greeks fleeing the Turks came to Europe, and that's long been proved false, even though some people still say this thing here and there. Rather, is by Arab agency, the tradition the Arabs received, made some progress with. The medievals, hungry for more knowledge on top of what they'd already learned, went, found the stuff, brought it back. Right? And that's a sure sign of what education is supposed to produce, men who want learning. Now, as the medieval life continues, you have a standardized system of education in the universities. You have your arts faculty, and you have your higher faculties, especially theology. You have your medicine faculties, like in Salerno, and also your law faculties in Bologna, and these spread around to other places too, and created the disciplines elsewhere. So as time went on, the university got standardized, systemized, and started to look more like it did today. Well, not so much like it did today. Today they look more like the characterizations of the Inquisition. But there was also another form of education that existed in Europe from the time prior to Charlemagne, and that's what's called the guild. The guild was not just something which protected the interests of a given discipline. It was something that established apprenticeship. It established a means for people to learn trades. And here's another thing that's important too. Education is not merely limited to academic disciplines. It also involves trades. It also involves simple disciplines, the ability to produce. And we'll see that we'll go more into this in our critique of modern education and its failures. But so these are the kinds of education that come down to us from the past. That's in a broad sense. That's in the stricter sense. What's education supposed to do? What's it supposed to produce?